I stood in the middle of my father's wedding, watching him hold the hand of the woman who drove my mother to suicide. They called it destiny. I called it a crime. When I held up their secret photo, every eye turned on me like I was the villain. But then, my brother stood, and when the recording played, no one could pretend anymore. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now for more stories that hit deep and leave a mark. Before everything fell apart, I believed my father was the one person who would never betray me. But in the end, he was the first to do it. I used to think my father's love just came with conditions. That if I achieved enough, behaved enough, stayed quiet enough, I'd be worthy. But I was wrong, because conditional love still implies love. And the truth I would come to learn that day was far colder. My father never loved my mother. And I, his youngest daughter, was collateral damage in a marriage built on something far worse than neglect. The car slowed down just past the iron gates of the oceanfront estate in La Jolla. It was the kind of place people rented for movie scenes, a sun-drenched cliffside villa, white marble columns and too many hydrangeas arranged like battalions across the lawn. I could hear the faint strains of a string quartet already playing even from inside the vehicle. Every note sounded like it cost $1,000. I stepped out of the car in heels I hadn't worn in years, the kind you wear to weddings where you know you'll be watched more than welcomed. The sunlight hit me like judgment, sharp and blinding. I adjusted the navy blue dress that hugged a little too tight around the ribs and tried to remember how to breathe. This was the third time my father was getting married. His first wife, my mother, Margaret, had died under what we were told were complicated circumstances. The second, a sleek corporate attorney named Renee, had lasted 4 years and a half-dozen prenups. Fiona, wife number 3, was 36, blonde, and once served as my father's executive assistant, and now apparently life partner. I'd seen their engagement announcement on a real estate magazine cover 2 months ago. Her hand rested on his chest like a possession. His eyes didn't smile. I wasn't sure why I came. Maybe some stupid part of me still believed a daughter showing up was enough to earn a seat at her father's table. Maybe I needed to see in person how easily he'd replace the woman who raised me, then erased her. The housekeeper greeted me at the door. She didn't remember my name. Inside, the place smelled like luxury and distance. White roses in crystal vases lined the hallway. Waiters passed with champagne, already sweating in slender glasses. The ceilings were high, the light sharp, everything curated. But it was cold. Cold in that way expensive places often are when no one is actually happy, just well-dressed and on script. I spotted Fiona almost immediately laughing a little too loudly with 2 guests who looked like magazine models. She wore white, of course. Not ivory, not champagne white, as if her past was just as pristine. Her dress was strapless and tightly corseted, and she moved like she'd been trained to glide instead of walk. Then there was my father, Douglas Hartman, 63, tanned, silver-haired, and sharper than the edge of the empire he'd built. San Diego's real estate king, a man who measured human value in returns and dividends. He was shaking hands with a congressman and speaking to a hedge fund manager about climate-resilient condominiums. I wondered if he even remembered I RSVP'd. I didn't belong here, and every step on the polished floor made it clearer. "Eliza's upstairs with makeup," a staff member whispered when I asked for my sister. "Nathan's coordinating valet flow." Of course they were. My half-siblings always knew where to be. They were the glossy children, Eliza the cardiac surgeon, who once made a TED Talk go viral for being emotionally efficient. Nathan, the oldest, a numbers prodigy who now ran the operational side of Hartman Holdings. And then there was me, Celeste, 29, editor at a struggling independent publishing house, daughter of the woman no one mentioned. The one they forgot to include in family newsletters but remembered when a photo op required symmetry. As I moved through the space, I noticed a clipboard on a podium listing speakers for the reception Eliza tribute reading. Nathan Toast, Fiona's mother, Fiona's niece. My name wasn't there. I checked again. Not an oversight, not a mistake. Just absence. Guest list says you're at table 11, said the event planner crisply without looking up. Table 11, I would later learn, was next to the kitchen doors, behind a support column. So far removed from the head table, it may as well have been off-property. I smiled because it was either that or scream. And I'd learned a long time ago that screaming made him dismiss me faster. I took my seat early. Might as well claim what was mine. The seat covers were ivory, the napkins folded like origami swans. There were name cards written in gold calligraphy. My name was spelled wrong. As guests started filtering in men in tailored suits, women in gleaming pastel gowns. I sipped water from a stemmed glass and tried not to stare too hard at the empty chair beside me. It was meant for +1, but I came alone. Not because no one offered, but because I knew what this was, a battlefield masquerading as a brunch. I scanned the room. Nathan was standing confidently by the bar, giving a tour of the wine selection to two venture capitalists in suede shoes. He looked like a cover of Forbes' Tall, Composed, Detached. He used to call me kid with affection, but that stopped when I turned 16 and challenged him about a lie he told my mother. We'd never recovered. Eliza floated into view next, air-kissing a journalist who used to date her. She was luminous and controlled hair in a tight bun that didn't move even as she laughed. Her diamond earrings caught the light like punctuation. Her dress was surgical red. Appropriate, I thought grimly. Neither of them had looked in my direction. Not once. The man who hadn't spoken to me since the funeral of my grandmother 5 years ago, when I'd accidentally knocked over a wine glass onto his cashmere sleeve. He hadn't said a word to me then, just looked at the stain, then at me, and walked away. Still, some reckless part of me stayed hopeful. That maybe my father would glance over, see me walk over, say something, anything that felt human. But at minute 7, as I folded and unfolded my napkin, I watched him wrap an arm around Fiona's waist, lean into her ear, and whisper something that made her throw her head back and laugh like she didn't have a secret in the world. And in that moment I understood. This wasn't my family anymore. And maybe it never had been. Underneath the orchestration of violins and forced laughter, something inside me began to crack. It started small, a shift, a memory, the kind that slips under the skin before you realize it's bleeding. When I was 14, my mother disappeared. Her name was Margaret Hartman, co-founder of the very company my father now ruled like a dynasty. She wasn't just my mother. She was the voice in my head that said, "You don't have to become like them to belong here." She wore navy blazers and cherry lipstick, and she could disarm my father's fury with a glance. For years, she was the reason my childhood didn't collapse under the weight of his ambition. Then one winter morning, she vanished. The story we were told was clean and cruel. She left. She met someone. She couldn't handle the pressure. My father said it with the conviction of someone reading off a teleprompter. Nathan repeated it like a company slogan. Eliza said nothing. I was 14 and shattered. There was no funeral, no investigation, just silence. A woman erased by a man who had always preferred the story he could control over the truth that might undo him. Now seated at a wedding I didn't believe in, surrounded by people who saw me as a decorative afterthought, the edges of that lie began to glow, like a fuse finally finding flame. I reached into my bag and pulled out the photo I kept tucked in my wallet. It was bent at the corners and smudged from years of handling. My mother stood in front of the original Hartman and Langley headquarters, a red brick building with ivy creeping up the sides, smiling so brightly it hurt. She held a binder in one hand, a latte in the other, and wore those navy heels she always said made her feel like she ran the world. That photo was taken 3 months before she vanished. I'd found it by accident hidden in the sleeve of one of her old record covers. My father never mentioned it, never acknowledged that she'd once had equal ownership of the company. Her name had vanished from the legal records within a year of her disappearance. Outside, the quartet struck up a delicate version of Pachelbel's canon, and the guests began moving toward the ceremony area. I stayed seated, clinging to that photo like it could anchor me in a sea of curated lies. "Miss Hartman," a soft voice interrupted. I looked up. A waiter, early 20s maybe, stood beside me holding a small cream envelope. "This was left for you," he said quietly. From one of the guests. They didn't give a name. I stared at the envelope. My name wasn't written on it. Instead, in slanted handwriting, it simply read, "You deserve to know." My fingers trembled slightly as I took it. The waiter bowed his head and disappeared into the crowd like he'd never been there. I opened the flap slowly. Inside was a single photograph, old but crisp. It showed my father, Douglas Hartman, standing arm in arm with Fiona. Not recently. The timestamp on the back read August 1997. My stomach clenched. That was 6 months before my mother disappeared. In the photo, Fiona looked even younger, barely 24, wearing a summer dress and a lanyard with a company badge. She was leaning into my father like she belonged there, like she'd already taken something that didn't yet publicly belong to her. I blinked, trying to make the math make sense, trying to hold on to the ground beneath me. My mother didn't run away in 1998 because she couldn't take the pressure. She vanished because by then her husband had already moved on. With someone who worked for her. Someone now standing in front of 300 guests in a designer wedding gown. My hands curled into fists. My breath caught. The lie had always been too neat. My mother had vanished. But maybe she hadn't left. Maybe she'd been erased. I stood abruptly, the envelope still clutched in my hand, and walked away from the table past guests, laughing about real estate markets and Napa wines, past a photographer snapping Fiona with her ring bearers. My legs moved without instruction. There was one person who might know the truth, and if she didn't give it to me, I would know that too. Behind the estate near the catering entrance stood an older woman in a simple black dress and apron, organizing trays of miniature crab cakes. Her name was Marla. She'd worked for our family since before I was born. She'd once taught me how to braid my hair when I cried about school photos, and after my mother vanished, she was the one who left warm milk outside my door and never asked me to talk. "Marla," I said, stepping toward her. My voice felt foreign in my throat. She turned eyes surprised, then softened. "Celeste. My God, you look just like her now." Her words struck deeper than she knew. I held up the photo of Fiona and my father. Her smile disappeared. "I found this in an anonymous envelope," I said. "It's dated before Mom disappeared." Marla's face shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Her lips parted, then pressed together in a tight line. Her hands clenched slightly around the tray. "Please," I said, my voice sharper now, "tell me the truth." She looked around quickly, then stepped closer. "Conbea, there are things you don't want to stir up, especially not today." Today I laughed bitterly. "He's marrying the woman he cheated with while my mother was alive. There is no good day to uncover betrayal." She winced. "Celeste, you always were too smart for your own good. Did Fiona work for him while he was married?" Marla hesitated, then nodded slowly like the movement hurt. "For your mother, actually," she said. "Fiona was her assistant before she moved over to him." My chest went still. And my mom, did she leave or was she pushed? Marla looked at me, truly looked, and I saw something ancient and sorrowful in her eyes. I don't know everything she said, but I do know your mother didn't leave by choice. I stepped back like she'd slapped me. I asked you once, I whispered after Mom disappeared. I asked if she would ever come back. And you said, some things vanish forever. Was that a lie? Marla didn't answer, which was of course the answer. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice raw. Because the walls in this family don't just have ears, she said. They bite. I stared at her. She turned back to the kitchen door as if our conversation never happened. But I wasn't the same. The photo in my hand felt like a matchstick. And somewhere inside me, something had just ignited. I wasn't looking for anything when I wandered upstairs. I wasn't trying to uncover secrets or rewrite history. I just needed air something different than the recycled scent of peonies champagne and expensive lies that saturated every square inch of that house. The second floor of the estate was quieter, dimmer. The sounds of string instruments and murmured pleasantries faded behind the heavy oak doors. I passed closed guest room doors, framed portraits of long-dead ancestors no one cared about, and thick carpet that muted every step like a silencer. I turned a corner and stopped at the sound of a door cracked open. It was Fiona's dressing suite, grand, high-ceilinged, lit with flattering chandeliers, and surrounded by racks of silk and makeup tables. I saw a glimpse of lace through the door's sliver of light. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Not at first. But then I heard my name, or something worse than my name, the ghost it was tied to. If she hadn't signed that withdrawal. Fiona's voice floated out sharp and fast and conspiratorial. We never would have gotten Hartman Holdings off the ground. She was always in the way. My pulse stuttered. She was still on the board, Fiona continued. Still had voting power. Still had access to those ledgers. God knows what she could have found. I moved closer, breath caught somewhere between lungs and ribs. My father's voice followed, colder than steel. That's why we had to make her look unstable. The affair story was perfect. People believe women leave. They don't question a woman who runs off with someone else. Especially not when her husband's the one writing the narrative. I think my soul actually recoiled. It wasn't a metaphor. It was something physical, something primal, like my blood tried to exit my body through my skin. I remember her crying in that boardroom, Fiona said, and her voice wasn't remorseful. It was amused. She still thought she could keep part of the company, that she mattered. She didn't, my father said flatly. She was too soft, too sentimental. And sentimental people break under pressure. It was only a matter of time. You're not worried she told Celeste anything? Fiona asked, her tone casual but calculated. A long pause. She was gone before the girl could understand anything he said. And Celeste? She's more like Margaret than she knows. Weak, idealistic. The kind of person who publishes poetry chapbooks instead of building legacies. My knees nearly gave out. I pressed my back against the wall, out of view, my hand covering my mouth. There it was. The truth spoken plainly, like it was nothing more than a business memo. My mother didn't leave. She was exiled, branded, stripped of everything. And the man who did it now stood downstairs preparing to toast to his new beginning. I staggered backward, stumbling away from the door before I heard anything else. I couldn't. My vision tunneled the corridor, spinning. I collided with a side table, nearly knocking over a vase. I didn't stop. I ran. Down the stairs. Through the crowd. Out the side door, past the marble statue of some Roman goddess who'd probably understand better than any of the guests inside. I collapsed behind a hedge wall near the garden terrace, doubled over, shaking. My stomach heaved, then heaved again. Nothing came up except the truth. Footsteps approached. I heard them before I saw him. Celeste. Scott's voice was gentle but urgent. I didn't look up. I didn't want him to see me like that. But he always did. He always had. He crouched beside me. Hey, what happened? I couldn't speak. I just held out the photo. And then the envelope. My hands were trembling so violently I nearly dropped them. Scott took them, his brow furrowing as he scanned. He didn't say anything at first, didn't ask, didn't offer platitudes. Instead, he sat next to me on the cold stone shoulder to shoulder. When I finally spoke, it came out ragged. They didn't just cheat. They erased her. They stole everything from her and wrote a story that made her look like a villain. I was 14, Scott. I hated her for leaving. I believed him. He didn't interrupt. I remember the day after she disappeared, he made me go to school, said I needed normalcy, said she'd call when she was ready, but she never did because she never had a chance to. My voice cracked. Scott put a hand on my back, grounding me. I grew up thinking I was like her, I whispered. Too soft, too fragile. I blamed her for being weak. But she wasn't weak. She was cornered. Scott's hand tightened slightly, and she was silenced. I can't let them get away with it, I said. I won't sit there and pretend this is a wedding. It's a coronation built on a corpse. His jaw tensed, but he nodded. So what do you want to do? I looked up, wiping my face with the edge of my dress. I don't know yet, but I'm not leaving. Not quietly, not again. And then I stood. Because the person who walked into that house an hour ago, silent, ashamed, uncertain, was gone. She had vanished like her mother had. But unlike Margaret, I was coming back. And this time, I wasn't alone. The string quartet was halfway through a lush arrangement of Vivaldi's Spring when the guests were ushered into the main garden. Rows of white chairs flanked a petal-strewn aisle leading to an altar framed by arching wisteria. A drone hummed faintly overhead, capturing the entire scene for social media highlight reels and the glossy video my father had commissioned. No one noticed I was missing from my assigned seat at table 11, but I was already in position. I stood behind a pillar draped in silk just beyond the perimeter of the stage where the ceremony was beginning. My chest throbbed like it contained thunder. Every inhale felt like swallowing glass, but my hands were steady. That alone terrified me. The officiant, a grinning former city councilman, cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, today, we celebrate a union built on vision, resilience, and devotion. I almost laughed, out loud. Fiona stood before my father in a dress so tailored it looked sculpted. Her veil fluttered slightly in the breeze, and her voice, when she began to speak, was polished and performative, like a business pitch, like she was closing the final deal of her career. I never imagined that an internship would turn into a love story, she said with a smile that felt laminated. But from our first late-night strategy meeting, I knew there was something extraordinary between us. That was it. That sentence. That smug, oblivious, damning sentence. I stepped forward. At first, no one noticed. I wasn't dressed like I belonged on that stage. I didn't have a role in the program. But as I crossed the aisle in full view, murmurs started. Heads turned. Whispers multiplied. By the time I reached the microphone stand, Fiona had stopped mid-vow. I didn't wait for silence. I took the mic. I apologize for interrupting, I said, voice clear-cutting through the garden like a blade. But since we're talking about origin stories, maybe this one deserves a fuller account. Gasps. Some guests thought it was a joke. My father took a half step forward, his eyes narrowing, his jaw clenched. I reached into my purse and pulled out the photo, the one from 1997. The one that proved Fiona and my father had been together before my mother disappeared. I held it up. My father told me my mother ran away when I was 14. That she left us. That she abandoned her company, her family, her child. I paused. The wind moved the veil behind me. Someone's camera clicked. A glass broke faintly in the back. But this photo, I said, was taken 6 months before that. That's Fiona. With him. Long before my mother disappeared. The garden went dead quiet. You could hear the ocean crashing below the cliffs like punctuation. Fiona's smile collapsed, then flickered back like she was still deciding whether to deny or pretend she was fainting. My father moved. He walked with practiced calm toward me, each step deliberate. When he reached the mic, he didn't speak. He simply grabbed the microphone, yanked it from the stand. "You're done," he said. "Quiet, lethal." But before he could turn away, before he could silence me like he had silenced my mother, a voice called out behind the crowd. "Let her finish." It was Nathan, my half-brother who hadn't looked me in the eye in years. He stood slowly from his chair near the front row, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket with meticulous control. Then he stepped into the aisle. "If you won't let her speak," he said loud enough for the guests and cameras and drones to catch, "then maybe it's time I did." My father turned, his eyes narrowed, calculating. "Nathan," he said, "this is not the time." "Isn't it?" Nathan cut in. "You've spent your entire life controlling the narrative. What gets said, what gets buried." He turned to the audience. My father built Hartman Holdings with my mother, Margaret Hartman. She was a co-founder, not a footnote, and she didn't walk away. She was pushed, manipulated, cut out. Gasps rippled through the guests. "I have proof," Nathan continued. "A recording from 2008, the day she signed the final withdrawal agreement. She didn't know the papers had been altered. She thought she was stepping away temporarily. You forged her exit. You erased her." Douglas moved toward Nathan, now fury climbing his face like fire up a curtain. "You're betraying your family," he snarled. "You don't even know what that document meant." "I know what it cost," Nathan said, voice steady. "I've listened to that recording 100 times." She begged for clarification. "Your lawyer rushed her. You sat there and watched." The crowd was stunned. Several guests had already taken out their phones. "You exploited her illness," Nathan continued. "You used her depression as leverage to make her sign away her stake. Then you told the world she ran off with someone else." My father looked around, realizing for the first time how many people were watching, not just physically, but digitally. Live streams, cameras, journalists in the back row. Fiona reached for his hand. He yanked it away. The officiant stepped backward, folding his binder. His face was pale. "This is slander," Douglas said, finally trying to speak above the noise. "Family drama. You're not getting your inheritance early, Nathan, if that's what this is." Nathan's voice dropped, dangerous in its calm. "I'm not asking for your money. I'm taking back our mother's name." A quiet fell. You could hear leaves shifting. The hum of the drone paused. Even the ocean seemed to hold its breath. And then a murmur rose, uneasy, confused, because this was no longer a wedding. It was a reckoning. Someone whispered, "Is this being recorded?" A woman near the front checked her phone and said, "Oh God, it's trending." But I didn't care about the headlines, or the whispers, or the jaws hanging open in disbelief. I turned to my father, and for the first time in my life, he looked small. Not because he was outnumbered, because he was exposed. Nathan walked up beside me. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, with me. We didn't need to win the room. We just needed to stop the lie. And that was exactly what we had done. My father didn't shout at first. That was how I knew he'd snapped. For a man like Douglas Hartman, anger was never loud. It was precision delivered with legal weight and private consequences. Until that moment. Until Nathan stood beside me, and the truth could no longer be steered into silence. Until power for the first time in his life had slipped publicly through his fingers. His voice rose like a siren, sharp and wrong against the cultivated elegance of the wedding ceremony. "Security!" he barked, pointing directly at me. "Get them the hell out of here, both of them!" There was a stunned silence. Two men in black suits hired for the wedding, no doubt expecting to handle drunken guests or stray photographers, hesitated. One looked toward the event coordinator. The other looked toward Fiona. Fiona said nothing. She simply took a slow step back. Now my father roared. It echoed across the cliffside garden like a gunshot. Several guests flinched. One child began to cry. Nathan didn't move. I didn't either. But a woman near the back had her phone raised. And I noticed something in the corner of my eye, a red light blinking at the top of her screen. It was live. We were being streamed. Someone else further left had their camera trained on my father's face. I caught the words on the screen: Hartman wedding chaos. Hearts floated up in real time. It wasn't just a family scandal now. It was a public event. A third camera turned toward us. And then the whispers turned into gasps. Oh my God, she's streaming this. It's on TikTok. Is this real? We didn't wait for the guards to move. Nathan turned to me and said calmly, "Let's go." And so we did. We didn't run. We didn't sneak out. We walked heads high back straight through the center aisle of white chairs and stunned stares and hushed breaths. Fiona was frozen near the altar. My father stood behind her, still breathing, hard lips curled and fury eyes red. As I passed him, I paused, just long enough to say quietly, "She deserved better than what you gave her." He didn't respond. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. By the time we reached the gravel lot behind the estate, my phone had already exploded. Texts, missed calls, group chats blinking with unread messages. Nathan's phone buzzed too. He glanced at it, sighed, and said, "It started." That night, the world shifted. At 9:12 p.m., the first video went viral, a 3-minute clip of me confronting my father with the photo and Nathan stepping in with the bombshell about the forged withdrawal documents. By midnight, the headline on page 6 read, "Wedding from Hell, Hartman daughter exposes billionaire father's dark secret, mid-vows." CNN Business ran a quieter version, "Hartman Holdings, rocked by family allegations amid high-profile wedding." But the damage was done. The story wasn't in business circles anymore. It was everywhere. They clipped my words. They looped Nathan's calm statement about the manipulated contract. They replayed the moment my father's voice cracked when he called for security. The public ate it up. By morning, Twitter was trending with the hashtag #HadJusticeForMargaret. And TikTok had crowned me the girl who blew up her father's wedding. Some thought it was performance art. Others called it bravery. A few trolls said I was a gold digger and unstable daughter. But the weight of reaction leaned toward the truth. Something about the calmness with which Nathan had said she was erased had landed in people's spines. By breakfast, 2 things had happened. First, Nathan sent the full recording, unedited, time-stamped, undeniable, to his legal counsel. Second, I received an email. The subject line read, "We believe this story matters." It was from a woman named Janelle Price, founder of a small, fiercely independent publishing house in Brooklyn. She'd seen the clip online, followed the rabbit hole of news coverage, and looked up my name. Her message was short but powerful. "Celeste, I don't know what your plans are, but if you're interested in telling the real story of what happened to your mother, I'd be honored to help you publish it. This kind of erasure is not new, but speaking out like that, the way you did with poise and pain and purpose, that is rare. Let me know. We'll protect you. We'll fight for it. Janelle." I read it twice, then again, then I cried. Not because I had a book deal, but because someone who had no reason to believed me. Without condition, without credentials, just believed. Meanwhile, Fiona vanished. Literally. No press appearances, no statement, no Instagram update. Her PR team released a single-sentence announcement: "Ms. Fiona Lawton has chosen to step back from public life and respectfully requests privacy." But the vulture smelled blood. Every media outlet wanted to know where she was, whether she had been part of the manipulation, how long she'd been involved, whether she'd had a role in Margaret's disappearance beyond the affair. People started digging. They found that Fiona had transferred a significant sum, close to $3 million, from a joint account with my father to a private LLC 1 week before the wedding. By day 3, her name had been scrubbed from the company's leadership page. By day 5, Hartman Holdings Board issued a preliminary statement. "We are initiating an independent audit into the events referenced during the private celebration held on Saturday. Hartman Holdings takes all allegations seriously and is committed to transparency." But it was too late. Boycotts started. On social media, real estate agents resigned from partnerships. A whistleblower came forward, an executive assistant, who confirmed that Margaret's name had been strategically erased from internal archives after her exit. The stock price dropped 17% in 2 days. By day 6, the board moved to suspend Douglas Hartman from day-to-day operations pending legal review. I watched it unfold like someone watching the aftermath of an earthquake from a mountaintop. The ground below them cracking, shifting, swallowing history whole. But I felt none of the satisfaction I thought I might. Just silence. Just the strange weight of breathing in a world that for the first time wasn't lying anymore. Nathan called me on day 7. "They're already spinning it," he said. "Lawyers are trying to frame it as a mental health crisis. That Dad was under strain when he pushed her out." "And Mom?" I asked. There was a long pause. "They're still trying to paint her as unstable," he said. "But not everyone's buying it anymore." Good, because the truth wasn't unstable. It had just been gagged for 20 years. Now it was roaring. The hardest part wasn't watching my father fall. It was realizing I had helped him build the ladder. Not intentionally. But with every moment I swallowed my questions, every time I repeated his version of the story to a friend or a therapist or to myself, I had stitched another inch into the lie. And now that lie was unraveling loudly publicly, but inside me it left a vacuum. 2 weeks after the wedding, I sat in a therapist's office in a low-rise building in North Park. Her name was Dr. Elaine Winters. The couch was soft and gray. The air smelled like lavender and unsaid things. She asked me why I was there. I told her because I let him erase her. And I didn't even fight it. Her face didn't flinch. That was the most disarming part. That no matter what I said, no matter how dark or humiliating, she didn't react the way the world had. I told her I had spent years blaming my mother for disappearing. That I believed she'd chosen to leave me. That I'd mourned her as a coward. I cried in a way I hadn't since childhood, no structure, no dignity, just noise and shaking and grief that didn't know what shape to take. Dr. Winters listened, then said, "That wasn't your fault. That was a wound, not a choice." I started therapy twice a week. It didn't fix anything immediately, but it gave me space to feel without apologizing. It gave me tools, language, the ability to name what had once only been a scream in my chest. I wrote a letter to my mother, not to send, just to write. It started like this: "You were right about everything, and I'm sorry I ever thought you were weak. The truth is I was. I was too young to know, and then I got older and didn't want to know, because if you were betrayed, that meant I was too, and that's a pain I wasn't ready for, but I am now, and I promise I'll make it right. Even if it's 20 years too late, even if no one else cares, I'll care for both of us." I printed it, folded it, and slipped it into the front of a hardcover copy of Jane Eyre, the one she gave me when I turned 12. That night I called Nathan. We hadn't spoken in 3 days, not out of distance, but exhaustion. The silence between us had changed. It was quieter now, less like avoidance, more like breath. He picked up on the first ring. "I've been reading her journals," he said, "the ones Marla kept." There was a pause. "I need to tell you something," he added. My stomach turned. Okay, I knew. Some of it. Not everything, but enough. His voice cracked. "I overheard them. Dad and his lawyer. I was 19. It was after Mom's first leave of absence. I knew they were pushing her out. I knew she didn't want to go." I sat down slowly. "Why didn't you say anything I asked?" "Because I was afraid," he said plainly. "I had just been promoted. Dad said he was grooming me to take over operations. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could protect her from the inside. But then she died. And I told myself it was too late." Silence stretched between us like a bridge too long to cross. "I hated you for that," I said quietly. "I know," he said. "I did too." Another pause. "But I'm done hiding," he added. "And if you're ready, I want to reopen the case." The case. The one that ruled her death a suicide brought on by extended emotional distress. The one that sealed the investigation with words like clinical depression and no foul play suspected. I remembered the day of her memorial. There was no coffin, just a framed photo and a table of orchids. No autopsy shared, no details, just that she'd gone in peace. Nathan and I agreed to start with her hospital records. They were surprisingly hard to access. Even with a lawyer's help, there were documents buried under requests and red tape. Her medical files were archived, her final hospitalization written off as voluntary rest, even though her therapist at the time had written concerns about increased anxiety due to external manipulation. It was buried, but not gone. 3 weeks in, we received a scanned copy of her intake form from a private mental health clinic in La Mesa, the last place she stayed before she died. Something stood out. A nurse's note scribbled in the margin. Multiple bruises on upper arms and right clavicle. Patient says she slipped on stairs, but pattern inconsistent with fall. No report made. I read it 3 times before I spoke. Why wasn't this flagged? I asked Nathan, voice cold. Because Dad paid for the clinic, he replied. He made a donation after she died, $500,000, in exchange for discretion. My stomach curdled. Do you think I started but couldn't finish? That he hurt her, Nathan said. I don't know. But I think he pushed her mentally, emotionally, maybe physically, until she broke. I stared at the PDF on my laptop screen, and for the first time I didn't feel confusion. I felt rage. Not the reactive kind. Not the I'm going to scream into a pillow kind. The cold, crystallized kind. The kind that plans. The kind that survives. We're not letting this go, I said. Agreed, Nathan replied. We both knew it wouldn't bring her back. But that wasn't the point. The point was they made her invisible, and we were going to make her seen. The drive to the coast was silent. Nathan sat beside me in the passenger seat, thumbing through a printed folder of notes and medical articles, while I focused on the road, though I could hardly feel my hands on the wheel. The air was thick with something unspoken grief, maybe, or the ghost of it, and it followed us all the way to the tiny clapboard house in Oceanside where Dr. Leonard Graves now lived. He had been the county's chief medical examiner 20 years ago. The man who signed off on the conclusion that my mother's death had been self-inflicted due to emotional instability. His name was stamped on the death certificate on every report the press was given on the final closure that erased any remaining hope. Now retired, he lived 3 blocks from the ocean and grew orchids in his sunroom. I knocked once, no answer. Nathan knocked again, louder. After a long pause, we heard slow footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, gaunt man in his late 70s with steel-colored hair and hollow cheeks. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, or maybe 20 years. Dr. Graves, I asked, my voice too steady. His eyes flicked between us. If you're here about an autopsy, I'm no longer in practice. It's about a very old one, I said. Margaret Hartman. He froze. For a moment, I thought he might slam the door. Instead, he said, "You have 2 minutes." He didn't invite us in. He just stood in the doorway like a sentry. Nathan pulled a folded piece of paper from his folder, a copy of the intake note from the clinic, the one referencing the bruises, the one that hadn't made it into the official coroner's file. Graves stared at it, then exhaled long and slow. "Where'd you get this?" "Does it matter?" Nathan said. Graves looked at me again longer this time. "You're her daughter," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," I replied, "and I've read your report." He flinched slightly. "I want to know," I continued, "why there was no mention of the bruises. Why you didn't question the absence of drug traces in a woman who'd been on anxiety medication. Why everything about my mother's case reads like someone trying to avoid asking obvious questions." He didn't answer right away. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, "but I'm not promising anything." The living room smelled like dust and medicinal tea. A faint old radio played classical music in the background. He gestured for us to sit on 2 armchairs across from a fireplace lined with unopened mail. I remember the case. He began settling into his own seat. "Of course I do. It haunted me." "Then why did you sign off?" I asked. His jaw tensed, because at the time Douglas Hartman was not just a grieving husband. He was the man every local politician owed favors to, the man who funded half the redevelopment board. He had leverage, influence, friends on the county health board, friends in City Hall. I had just buried my wife. I had 3 grandkids I was raising. I wasn't brave enough. I stared at him, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. She deserved the truth, I said. I know, he whispered. There was something unbearable in his voice, something that suggested he'd said those same words to himself 100 times in the dark. I never examined her body, he admitted. Not properly. They said it was a suicide. The scene was clean. The clinic had signed off on her emotional state. The family didn't push for more. He paused. And by family, I mean your father. What about the bruises? Nathan asked. I never saw the full intake forms, Graves said. What you have those margins, it looks real. And if it is, then someone kept it from me. Silence fell. Then he leaned forward, eyes sharper now. You want the truth, he said. Then get a judge to sign off on exhumation. Get an independent pathologist. Because that body is the only one who hasn't spoken yet. We left with no promises, but something deeper, the stench of suppressed truth, now cracked open. 3 days later, Nathan submitted the official request to the county for posthumous re-examination. It took longer than expected, pushback, logistical complications, red tape that smelled suspiciously like protection, but we had leverage now. Public pressure. The media storm hadn't passed. It had only gotten louder. And someone at the DA's office must have realized the optics of resistance. We got the approval. The remains were transferred to a private facility. The pathologist was independent and thorough. We weren't allowed in the room, but Nathan had arranged for our attorney to be present. The call came 4 days later. I answered on the first ring. There's something our attorney said. They've done the preliminary toxicology. My heart caught. There were elevated levels of norphenfluramine. What is that? It's a metabolite of fenfluramine, she explained. A stimulant once used for weight loss. Banned in the U.S. years ago due to its cardiac risks. It's not prescribed. And it's not supposed to be in anyone's system. I swallowed. What does it mean? It means your mother didn't overdose on antidepressants. She was poisoned. With a substance known to induce heart failure, especially in patients with stress-induced arrhythmia. Silence. She didn't take her own life, I said flatly. No, she confirmed. She didn't. The floor didn't fall out from under me, because it already had. This was just confirmation. The final piece of a puzzle I never asked to inherit. A legacy no daughter should have to carry. I hung up, walked to my window, and looked out at the sky. Gray. Quiet. Still. And somewhere out there, I imagined my mother for the first time resting without the weight of someone else's lie tied to her name. We had the truth now. And we weren't done. The morning the package was delivered, I didn't open it right away. It sat on my kitchen counter like a coiled snake, thick bound in a legal envelope stamped with the logo of the San Diego District Attorney's Office. Nathan stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the sun rise over the city we were about to shake. I told them everything he said quietly. All the dates, all the voices, all the files. I nodded, still staring at the envelope. Inside was our mother's vindication. Or maybe just the start of another storm. By noon, it was official. The DA had opened a case. Douglas Hartman was being summoned for a preliminary deposition. That same day, the Financial Division launched an internal audit of Hartman Developments for suspected corporate fraud, forced acquisitions, and the wrongful termination of whistleblowers. The company's headquarters was placed under temporary supervision, computers seized, accounts frozen. I watched it unfold on my phone, streamed by reporters standing outside the glass towers my mother once helped design. And yet, for all the walls collapsing, the man at the center of it barely flinched. At 2:00 p.m., Douglas Hartman arrived at the downtown legal office in a navy blue suit. His tie perfectly knotted, his smile still the same sharp curve that once disarmed entire boardrooms. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted. He said nothing. But I could read his face. He wasn't here to confess. He was here to fight. That night our inboxes exploded. Not from media, from ghosts. Former employees, former partners, even a former maid from our childhood home, each with a piece of the buried truth. Stories of silence bought with severance packages, of legal threats, of files that vanished overnight. One email came from a woman named Clarissa Mendoza. She had worked as an executive assistant to Douglas for 6 years until 2008. The year my mother died. She wrote, "He called it the Clean Slate Project. He said if we wanted to grow, we had to cut the past loose, that Margaret didn't have the vision anymore." She cried in her office for days. I was told not to check on her. And then, one night I saw Fiona leaving Douglas's office. They didn't see me, but they were laughing. I knew then that something was coming. I just didn't know it would end in a funeral. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Nathan stood behind me. "This isn't a case anymore," he said. "It's a reckoning." 2 days later, Douglas held a press conference. It was scheduled for 1100 a.m. Sharp streamed live on every local network held at a luxury hotel in La Jolla. I watched from my apartment, heart-pounding phone in hand. He stood at the podium, flanked by his lawyers. Cameras zoomed in on the furrow of his brow, the practiced tension in his shoulders. "I am heartbroken," he began, "that during what was meant to be the happiest week of my life, I have instead been forced to address vile accusations manufactured by a daughter with a history of emotional instability and a son who has betrayed his own blood." My jaw tightened. "This is not about justice," he continued. "It's about resentment. It's about children who have failed to achieve anything of their own and now seek to destroy what others have built." He paused for effect. The room was dead silent. "Let me be clear," he said. "These allegations are false. I loved Margaret. I mourned her. And I refuse to allow this family's name to be dragged through the mud by those too bitter to move on." At that moment, I thought I might throw something at the screen. Instead, I opened the file Nathan had sent me 2 nights earlier, the one he hadn't shared with anyone else. Yet. The recording! It was grainy but unmistakable. I'd listened to it 5 times already. The rustle of papers, the low hum of a conference room AC, and then Douglas's voice, calm, clipped, casual. "She'll sign it. I've got Fiona handling the rest. Margaret won't know it's not a real vote until the ink is dry." Another voice, Nathan's younger, hesitant. "But what if she fights it?" Douglas again. "She won't. She's too tired. And once it's done, we leak the story about her affair. Public shame works wonders." I uploaded the file to a secure drive, sent the link to 3 reporters. Then I hit post. The clip went live at 11:23 a.m. mid-press conference. I watched as someone on stage handed Douglas a phone. He went pale, then furious. Then he walked off the stage without finishing his statement. By noon, the world had changed. The clip was everywhere. Twitter, YouTube, headline banners across every news site. Douglas Hartman caught admitting to forged documents and defamation of deceased wife. Nathan and I didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just sat side by side in my apartment watching the empire crack. By 2:00 p.m., Douglas's attorneys withdrew from the case, citing a breakdown of trust. By 4:00 p.m., 3 investors announced they were pulling out of Hartman Developments. By 5:30 p.m., the California State Bar Association had launched a review into the legal team involved in the 2008 transfer. But it wasn't until the sunset that something shifted inside me. That night, I visited my mother's grave. For the first time in years, I brought no flowers. No letters, just silence. And then I whispered, "They heard you, Mom." And for the first time in my life, I believed it. She was no longer a footnote. She was the reason the truth clawed its way back to the surface. And we weren't done yet. I never expected the headlines to say his name before mine, but there it was. Splashed across the morning paper, the screen of every news app, the murmurs of the city echoing what I had screamed into a microphone days before. Douglas Hartman officially indicted. It hit like a quiet bomb. The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They just stood there sharp and final like the end of a dynasty printed in black ink. Embezzlement, securities fraud, corporate manipulation, and buried at the bottom of the indictment, a phrase that made my hands go cold. Reopening of the suspicious death case of Margaret Hartman, 2008. For the first time in my life, the law was speaking the name of my mother not as a disappearance, not as an embarrassment, but as a victim. And I was no longer alone in remembering her that way. The morning Douglas was arrested, I didn't go to the courthouse. Nathan did. He told me later how our father walked in head-high cuffed, but still charismatic like a man refusing to believe the ground had truly opened beneath him. He didn't look defeated, Nathan said. He looked insulted, and maybe he was. For a man who built his world on the belief that no one would ever dare stand taller than him, maybe that was the worst betrayal of all. The news crews camped outside the building for hours. Commentators analyzed every second of footage, his downcast eyes, the shaking of his hand, the silence as the judge read out the charges. The internet had its field day, but I didn't watch. Instead, I sat alone in the very garden where his wedding had been staged. The string lights still hung dead bulbs dangling like ghosts of the lie we'd exposed. The white arch where Fiona once stood, smiling, radiant, ruthless, was now cordoned off with yellow tape. A scene of a different kind of ceremony, one that began with truth, not vows. Fiona, of course, was gone, vanished 2 days after the recording was posted. Her social media wiped clean, her assistant's voicemail full, and her condo emptied out before the subpoenas arrived. Nathan pulled some strings through contacts in financial security. Belize, he said, tapping his phone screen. She's there. La Isla Bonita. Figures. A quick transfer of $2.6 million had flagged her to authorities. Her accounts frozen. Her passport flagged. An arrest warrant had been filed with international authorities within hours. But she wouldn't run forever. Somewhere in some hot coastal villa, Fiona was learning that the woman she helped erase had a daughter. And that daughter had teeth. A week passed. Then 10 days. The trial date was set. And somewhere between subpoenas and phone calls, Nathan made a choice. I'm leaving the company, he told me one night, over takeout cartons and silence. For good. I didn't speak, just watched him carefully. He was no longer the man I remembered from childhood, a figure in suits and boardrooms, always a little too polished to reach. Now his voice trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from clarity. I spent years living under his shadow, he said, knowing, pretending not to know. I don't want to fix Hartman developments. I want to build something that never needed him to begin with. And with that, we started what we knew was overdue. The Margaret Foundation. Not a monument, not a revenge project, but a rebirth. We filed the paperwork together. A nonprofit dedicated to women pushed out of family-owned businesses. A grant program for whistleblowers inside corporate systems. A mentorship network for daughters who had to become mothers to themselves. And the first donation, Nathan's severance check. The second, a royalty advance from a publishing house interested in the book I hadn't yet written, but apparently the world now wanted. They called me a hero. I hated the word. Hero implies victory. Clean endings. Standing tall with your fist in the air. But what I felt was still fractured, quiet, raw. There were days I still questioned my voice when I used it. Nights I slept with the lamp on, afraid of what silence would bring. But I was no longer drowning in guilt. I was swimming through something more honest. And that maybe was enough. On a rainy Wednesday, I stood on the steps of the same courthouse where my father had entered in cuffs. Dozens of reporters circled, microphones in my face, and I said only this: my mother was erased with a lie. I refused to be silent with the truth. No one should have to destroy a family to find justice, but sometimes justice is the only thing strong enough to destroy what never deserved to stand. That quote went viral, not because it was clever, but because somewhere someone else heard it and felt less alone. And that was the closest I'd ever come to peace. The night the story aired in full edited, narrated set to piano music and played before a national audience, my phone lit up. One text from a woman I didn't know. My mother's name was never spoken again after she disappeared from my life. Tonight it was. And then, thank you for lighting a match where most of us still fear the dark. I stared at those words for a long time, lit a candle, and whispered my mother's name. Margaret, you were not a footnote. You were the start of my sentence. And now, it belongs to me. Seattle didn't smell like San Diego. It smelled of wet bark, old books, and coffee that knew how to stay warm in the rain. It was quieter, too. Less steel, less gloss, less ghosts. And that was what I needed. I didn't come here to hide. I came here to begin. The first time I turned the key into the storefront, the place still smelled like paint and dust. But the sign above the door had already been hung freshly carved gold letters against midnight wood. Marigold Press. The name wasn't for branding. It was for her. Marigold, my mother's favorite flower. Fragile in name, but impossible to kill. I remember watching her plant them in little cracked pots on our apartment windowsill when I was small. They bloom even when the air doesn't want them to, she'd said. Like you. This wasn't just a publisher. It was resurrection. I slept on a mattress in the back room the first month. Worked until my hands blistered sanding shelves, ordering inventory building desks that leaned slightly because I was never good with a wrench. But every hour was a step toward oxygen. There was no echo of my father's voice here. No Fiona in heels clicking down marble floors. Just stories. Just people with pages they weren't brave enough to speak aloud yet. I read them all. The manuscript from the woman in Ohio who escaped a cult at 16. The poetry from the girl in Montana whose father called her mistake more often than her name. The essay from a man who confessed he'd never said I'm sorry until after his mother died. I read every word like scripture, and then I told them I believe you. On the day I submitted my own book to print, I vomited in the sink. Not from fear, but from release. It was called The Truth at the Wedding, but it wasn't revenge. It was a letter to Margaret, to every woman erased from boardrooms, to every daughter told she was too emotional, to the part of myself I once silenced because I wanted to be loved more than I wanted to be whole. The opening line was simple. My father married someone new the year I learned he'd murdered my mother's story. Not her body. Her story, because stories die when no one believes them, and stories live when someone says I do. I pressed send and sobbed like I hadn't in a decade. 3 weeks later, the book arrived in boxes. Matte cover, marigold on the spine, weightless in color but heavy in truth. I placed the first copy on the center table of the shop. Didn't open it, didn't need to. But the next morning, a woman came in, mid-40s, quiet. She stood by the display without speaking for nearly 10 minutes. Then she whispered, "Is this about your mother?" I nodded. She nodded back and cried. That's when I realized it was working. Not the pages, not the press, but the unburying of pain, of truth, of names too long buried under shame. A few days later, Nathan flew up. He was paler, thinner. San Diego was eating him alive even in our father's absence. But he smiled when he walked in and saw the name on the door. She'd love this, he said. Then he handed me something wrapped in tissue. A dress. Faded ivory. Lace with tiny hand-sewn pearls at the collar. My mother's wedding dress, he said. I thought you should have it. I didn't ask why it was with him. Didn't ask how he'd found it. Just held it like it might fall apart. That night, I sat cross-legged on the floor of the shop, the dress spread in front of me like an altar. And I noticed something odd, a slight bulge beneath the lining. I turned it inside out and found it. A letter, old, folded carefully, yellowing. My name on the outside in handwriting I hadn't seen since I was 14. If you're reading this, I'm probably already gone. I couldn't breathe, not for a second. Then I opened it, and the world fell silent. Celeste. If you're reading this, I'm probably already gone. I pray to whatever is left of God that you never have to. But if you are, then you deserve to know what happened. Your father and I built something once together. A business, a home, a life. And when I stopped agreeing with him, he started erasing me, piece by piece. At first it was meetings, then credit, then my name on the contracts. And then it was me. I signed something I didn't understand under pressure I couldn't fight. And one day I woke up and realized I was the villain in a story he wrote without me. I don't know how long I can live with that. But you are not me. You are fire in soft skin. You are clarity where I was confusion. You are the reason I stayed as long as I did. If you choose to bury this letter and forget it, do so in peace. But if you choose to remember me, do it loudly. Do it without shame. And do it without needing anyone's permission. You are not the shadow of my grief. You are the light I never got to become. I love you more than the silence ever could. Mom, I didn't sleep that night. Just laid in bed holding the paper against my chest, as if it could anchor me from drifting into pieces again. She had known. She had seen what was coming. And still she'd chosen to leave me a map back to her voice. The next morning, I hung the letter framed behind the register. Customers asked about it. I told them it was my origin story, and they understood. Because all of us are walking stories, and some of us are just lucky enough to find the missing pages. By the time The Truth at the Wedding hit bestseller lists, I'd stopped checking numbers. It wasn't about how many copies. It was about how many wounds it found, how many other daughters lit candles with it, how many mothers were remembered through it. I wasn't healed, but I was healing, and that was enough. We replaced the old plaque with a new one. It read, Margaret D. Hartman Mother, Visionary, silenced too soon, but never again. And then we left marigolds. Dozens. The whole hillside bloomed in orange and gold. I knelt beside her and whispered, You planted me in shadow, but I found the sun anyway. And this time, the silence felt holy. The day of the memorial arrived cloaked not in grandeur but in quiet dignity. No red carpet, no press, no orchestra. Just a sea of folding chairs under an open sky by the cliffs of La Jolla, where Margaret once brought her children for picnics before everything shattered. The wind was soft. The sea breathed steadily behind them, and the air carried a kind of silence that only grief could justify. Celeste stood at the front, her hands not shaking for the first time in weeks. Around her were people who mattered not because of their titles or wealth, but because they had loved her mother or had once been broken by her father. The florist had filled the space with marigolds, deep gold and orange, warm, like the kind of love Margaret gave so sparingly, yet so fiercely. She inhaled. I used to think Celeste began that I was the fracture in this family, that my silence was the cost of peace, that if I spoke, I'd break something already fragile. She glanced at Nathan in the front row. His eyes lowered, hands clasped, guilt carved into every corner of his face. But I was wrong. I wasn't the fracture. I was the light through it. The light that made the cracks visible. A gust of wind caught her hair. Her voice didn't waver. My mother wasn't perfect, but she was honest. And what was done to her should never be buried behind a stock price or a champagne flute. She died carrying truths that weren't hers to carry. So today we lay those truths down beside her and let her rest. She paused, then placed a sealed letter on the altar. Margaret's letter, the one Celeste had found inside a wedding dress tucked in storage, yellowed but intact. The words still scorched her chest. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it through the fight I couldn't name. But you, my daughter, you were born of fire. Don't become me, become free. Celeste didn't cry. She didn't need to. The silence that followed said everything. Nathan rose. He walked toward the altar holding an old photo frame, Margaret in the backyard arms, wrapped around all three children, frozen in the last summer before everything collapsed. He placed it beside the letter and the flowers, then looked at Celeste. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me that we still have a choice." Then without theatrics, he sat back down. The ceremony continued with soft music, no speeches, no sermons, just presence, just truth. As the sun began to fall behind the sea, Celeste stepped away. She walked down the cliff path barefoot now, the grass cool beneath her feet. Scott stood at a distance watching but not approaching. He knew she needed this walk alone. At the edge where the cliffs met the beach, she paused. The wind tugged at her dress. Her eyes scanned the horizon, not in search of anything but in acknowledgement. Behind her was the legacy of a man who built towers and buried women beneath them. Before her was nothing but sea and sky, and that finally was enough. She exhaled. Not a dramatic sigh, but the kind of release that comes when you've said everything that was never supposed to be said. Her phone buzzed. A message from the publisher. The first print run of The Truth in the Wedding had sold out. Reviewers were calling it a razor to the myth of the perfect family. Others called it too raw, too dangerous. She smiled. Margaret would have understood. Back at her small house in Seattle, Marigold Press was preparing its next book, a collection of letters from daughters who had chosen to speak. Celeste didn't believe in revenge, not anymore, but she believed in truth, in healing through daylight, in burning away rot with words, and in the power of walking away not to escape but to begin. The last image, Celeste walking along the shoreline, the waves chasing her footsteps, her eyes forward, her spine tall, the wind in her hair. She was not the outcast. She was not the disappointment. She was the survivor. The screen slowly faded to black. Text appeared, "Truth doesn't return the past, but it opens the path forward." Then one final line in white lingering just a second longer, for Margaret, and for every voice that was silenced.